Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Delta DNA exciting webinar. This afternoon, we're going to be covering direct access. So that's how to connect directly to the data warehouse where we're storing your event data and run queries directly against it, either in a database management tool or in a wide range of different ODBC compliant database tools. So, without further ado, I'll dive straight in. Before we actually do connect your data and start running some queries, if you have any questions, by all means, stick up your hand and type them into the questions box in the webinar. We will try and answer your questions, but obviously we're not going to have time in this webinar to get into any really heavy SQL, but we can, if you do have any questions after the webinar, do use the support buttons on the documentation portal to get in touch with us, as we may well be able to help you with some of your SQL. We see a lot of people running queries, and as we go through this, you'll see some of the power of the system behind the scenes, some of the things you can do. So by all means, if you're trying to do exciting things and struggling, do let us know, and we can get someone in the analytics team to take a look at your queries and give you a hand. So what we'll go through this afternoon, we'll talk a little bit about the structure of the data, how we actually store it, and let you see how we can then run queries against that data. There's more than one database table behind the scenes that we let you access. We let you look at the events that are coming in that you're sending to us, but we also keep a record of certain metrics against each of the players, and these are updated dynamically by the platform as your players are playing. So there's certain things you can query about those. We'll take a look at some actual queries themselves and show you some tricks and tips, some nice things you can do in the particular version of SQL that we're running. And finally, see if there's any quick questions we can answer. So you'll see on the right of my screen here, I'm showing you there is a section on the documentation site all about the direct SQL access. Do take a look at it. I'm not going to, in this webinar, go through the whole process of how to set up a connection to us and plug it into the various tools. There's a very detailed section on the help pages all about this. It's in the analytics data mining section of the documentation site. There's a connection guide that tells you how to download the drivers to connect to our direct access and how to then plug them into a selection of tools. You can plug them into pretty much any ODBC compliant tool though, but do take a look at this because there are a couple of gotchas depending what operating system versions you're running. But once you do get connected, what we'll be able to do is actually look more deeply into your data. So I'll start off by explaining a little bit about the structure of the platform and how we store your data. When you look at Delta DNA, you'll see you have different navigation options. As you move down through these options, you're actually going through increasingly more sophisticated toolkits. The dashboard and measure charts up at the top are essentially running on aggregated data. So the data you're looking at here is not user level specific, it's aggregated across all the users for a certain day, the number of sessions, etc. So at this level of data, detail, you're not getting right down to all the events and all the custom parameters that you're sending. However, as you move down through this navigation list into the Analyze section of tools, that's where you then start hitting the raw analytics database. So the reason the Delta DNA platform is so fast and lets you do so many exciting things with your data is essentially because a lot of it runs on this Hewlett-Packard Vertica analytics database. So this is a very fast database system that essentially lets you query directly against the raw events and parameters that are sitting in your hot data window, which is typically, the hot data typically will sit at around about 30 days, but that can be increased. That's just an arbitrary number. So come talk to us if you do need to extend that. There will be storage costs associated with it, but we can extend that further. And the benefits of this Vertica Analytics database is it lets you run very, very fast ad hoc queries against your data. So you can start really querying any data, any parameters, any events, and really digging into them. The third piece of the equation with regard to the data is the archives. We do also store your events in an archive, so if you need to get any of the data back or you want to download any of it into your own systems, you can do that at any time. Those are all stored on Amazon S3, and each night there will be a compressed archive built of all the days, all the events from the previous day, and they'll be uploaded onto your Amazon S3 account. And if you take a look on the game details page for any of your games, you'll see the URL and login credentials to your Amazon S3 archives. The reason I mentioned those is do make use of those if you're wanting to download large chunks of data. The direct access stuff that I'm about to start showing you is not really intended for doing massive exports, and I'll show you a couple of reasons why in a few minutes. So if you do need to download big lumps of data, go to the S3 archives rather than trying to use the Vertica Analytics system to do that. So the next thing to talk about is how your data is actually stored in the database. There's two different tables I mentioned that we're going to store your data in: the events table and the users table. The simplest way to think about the events table is just that there's a row in a database for every event you send, and there's a column in the database for every possible parameter you might be sending. So the structure is just one great big single wide table that you can query against. That's not strictly the 100% truth. There can actually be more than one row per event in some circumstances, but there is one column per parameter. So the database schema will actually, as you add new parameters to your game, you might update your game and add a few new events and add some new parameters to those with a new build of the game. The structure of the table will dynamically update to accommodate those new parameters as it sees them. So everything will fit in this one wide table, and that makes it actually really nice and easy to query. So simplistically, just consider it as one row per event, and I'll explain the exceptions in just a moment. So you can see from this screenshot here, we can see we've got an event ID, a user ID, session ID. We're giving it a date, a timestamp, and an event name. The exceptions to this are transaction events, level up events, essentially any event where you can have a nested array of items within the event. So a transaction event where you're maybe spending one real currency to receive two different items and some virtual currency, that transaction event would break down into multiple rows. And you can actually see from my image here, I've got a transaction event that looks like it's spanning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. That's the reason for that. The first line will be the actual transaction itself, and the other lines will represent the child items within that transaction. You can we'll maybe take a look at one when I actually get into SQL, and I can show you how that breaks down. But there's a couple of parameters you can use to identify the parent and child elements of the event and see how they kind of relate to each other. The other exception is there are some parameters that you'll see in here that you think, hang on, I didn't put those in my events, where did they come from? That's because there are some parameters we'll actually derive and automatically populated. So for example, event date is one of them. You don't tell us the date, but it's handy to know, so we put it in. There's also things like the user start date and their gender and location are automatically pumped into every event. The other table that you can look at, that was the events table, so that's events that were just coming in as you chuck events at us. The other table is a user metrics table, and this gets really quite interesting. The user metrics table is continuously updating as your events arrive. So as we learn things about the player, we'll update what we store in essentially the user metrics table about them. So as a player fires a game started event, we recognize that's them playing another session, so their user sessions counter will increment. So this can be used to access a user and essentially see a bunch of interesting things about that user at any time. The parameters you send to us on your events, the certain ones of these will get turned into metrics and we'll use them automatically. So if you've had a look around the segmentation tools on the platform, you'll already maybe have seen some of this stuff, but you'll see inside the segmentation tools this concept of generic metrics. These are things about the user we figure out all ourselves just from your events. So that's things like total days played, total currency spent. But you can also turn any of your events and parameters into metrics as well. So we also have different groups of metrics. We have counts of events. So you'll see things in the metrics table like event game count, game started count, event level up count, and that's simply a count of the number of times that event has been seen for that player. We can use your parameters, string-based parameters or integer-based parameters to drive metrics. And if they're integer-based ones, you'll see a variety of aggregated parameters that you can store as metrics. So the first and last, the minimum and maximum, the count and the sum of an integer parameter can be turned into a metric. With string-based parameters, you can see the first and last incarnation of that parameter. So that's how the user metrics table works. There is a row stored in that for every user in the game, and you can see there's also a row stored for that for each user for each of the last 60 days. That 60-day thing may change in the future, but the basic point is you can access the most recent metrics for any player in your game, even if they haven't played for months and months and months. So that's kind of the basics of how the user metrics work. So the best thing probably now is actually to dive in and show you some queries. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull across the database management tool that we're going to use. Let me just do that. So you should now be able to see my database management tool of choice. This is DBeaver. It's a free download, and we use it quite a lot. It's possibly one of the simplest database tools to connect up to Direct Access. And when you do connect up, if you look at the instructions on the documentation site that I kind of pointed you towards earlier, you'll see that it runs, the way we're connecting to it is actually through a Postgres driver, but we just use that essentially with the line communications protocol is nice and simple. What it's hitting behind the scenes is this Vertica Analytics database, even though it says Postgres when you connect to it. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just, I've got a really simple query here that shows how to connect to the events table and run a query against your mission events. So this one, we're just selecting the number of moves remaining and a count of the event date. Let's run this. What you'll see is that the query runs very, very quickly. The Vertica Analytics database is very, very, very fast. I mentioned that I would actually show you something about the transaction events, so let's just pick up some transaction events. Select star from So I'm just going to pull a dozen transaction events and we'll have a wee look at them. And just to make sure, just get it really nice and quickly, let's just say where the event actually happened today. Whilst I'm typing this, it's probably worth mentioning, you should take a look at the kind of structure of your events and be familiar with what events you're recording and what parameters you're sending. And you will learn what the essentially what you can go looking for a lot more easily. So you'll see here we've got some transactions. I mentioned that there is nesting within them, so this event level parameter is how you can tell the parent and child parts of a transaction event. And if I just highlight these and scroll along, we'll see what was actually happening in this event. Okay, so what we had here, we had a transaction that's name was gold purchase, and in here it looks like they received a standard power pack and they spent some gold. The gold balance at the end of the transaction was 5, and if I look at, here we go, the item amounts, the product spent was virtual currency, and we'll actually get in there. We'll have to pick out the item amounts and currency amounts, etc. So you can see that's essentially how we split out transactions across multiple rows, and you would use the event level parameter to see which bits are parent and child. And there's also, if you look, we have an event ID, and if I scroll along you'll also see that we have parent event ID that you can use to tie it all back together. So you can see there that these two were the children. So that's essentially how the transaction event works. To take a look at the user table, let's run a quick query against that. Let you see what the data looks like there. In this case, because we do have those multiple rows per user, like one for each day in the last 60 days, I'm querying this and saying I want the effective date equal to be today. So just give me today's data for 20 random users. So what that's showing us is there's their effective date, user ID, when was the user last seen, and here's all their metrics starting to pull out. So there's total days played, that was one of the generic ones, possible days played. If I scroll along, you'll see there's more generic metrics, the total time played in milliseconds, the total events they've ever sent, sessions played. So it's all really useful stuff. And as we go along, you'll see here's all their different event counts, number of times this guy's completed a mission, number of times they've started a mission, and there's going to be parameter based ones as well. So here's the last episode name they ever played, the first episode name they ever played, and on and on. To turn a parameter into a metric, let me just probably glossed over that a bit. If I go back to this screen here, when you're in your event management screens, and particularly your game parameters screen under setup, you'll see these little tick boxes on the parameter. By default, these will be off when you add a new parameter, but if you want the parameter to be included in the metrics, just hit the check boxes against which metrics are important. You can see on this one we've ticked all of them. On some it might be that you only want the first or the last, or you might not need all of them. And you can actually see that in that query I ran a second ago, there was one, the first mission that everybody played was set as a metric, when realistically there's not much point in capturing that because it's going to be the same for absolutely every user. So do but don't just set everything to be a metric, because all that's going to do essentially is slow down your queries. But if you're sensible about it, you'll be able to kind of capture any important things as metrics. The next thing you might want to do, and we see this happening sometimes, is joining between the user events table, the events table, and the user metrics table. You can absolutely do that, but just a couple of things to be aware of. When you're looking at your events table, the users, a lot of the parameters are named exactly as you would be sending them from the event. So things like, let's pick that transaction event up again. So you'll see the user ID is camel case with a small u and then the capital ID. So this all matches up with what you were sending in your events. When we get across to the user table, everything is actually stored in our own internal naming convention. So user IDs actually become user underscore ID. So one thing to watch out for when you're doing those joins is that your join is between user ID and user underscore ID. And the only other thing to watch is the current date thing. That's what I mentioned before. Just check your effective date is today, and that will give you the most recent set of metrics for a user. So what I've done in this particular query, I've just done a join across, and what are we looking for here? Let me just double check what the query is doing. We're selecting the mission name and a count of the missions for a bunch of users who have failed and have failed on a very specific mission and have no lives left. So you can see there I'm actually able to join between the two. That's maybe not the most exciting query I could have done, but it proves that you can join between events and metrics tables. Let me just go back to PowerPoint just to make sure I'm not running ahead or behind or skipping anything. I've seen our events, there's our queries. Yes, I have. I should point out that the tables you've got, I've been looking at the events live and user metrics live tables. There are development versions of both of those, so there's a table for each of your environments. There's our join between the two. Is that the same query? Yep, that's the same query. So that's the join between events and metrics. The next query I'm going to show you is, I think I've got my slide out the sequence here perhaps. Yep, I'll show you this one next. Case queries can be quite interesting. They let you start building up counts of things without doing inner joins across the query. So let me just run that one and show you what that was all about. What you'll find when you're running queries against Vertica is it is very, very fast, but depending how you structure your queries, you can slow it down or make horrendously complicated queries. So there's some lovely features inside Vertica that let you kind of build queries that are less complex and let Vertica actually do the hard work of figuring things out, and it will do it a lot more quickly. So in this particular one, we're looking at just the mission events. So we said we're looking at the events table, and we're looking for a count of the unique user IDs, the missions they're playing, and we're filtering this by the mission started, completed, and failed events, and grouping it by the mission name. And then we're just using a case statement to then take account of the occurrences of start, complete, and fail. So we can actually see from these if there are particular missions where we're getting a higher or lower success or fail rate than others. So you could see this is actually now pulling out the number of unique users per mission, what the mission name is, then a count of how many people started, how many people completed, how many people failed. So that's a kind of really nice way of using case statements. In this one, I've got my number of rows limited to 200, but you saw how quickly it came back with the query results there. Were 2.3 seconds, and it figured all that out. So you'll see if you structure your queries nicely, it's very fast and pleasurable to work with. The next thing I'll show you is where we start getting a little bit more funky. The next one I'm going to show you are common table expressions, and that slide there. If you've not seen these before, do Google it and take a look at common table expressions. They essentially let you build temporary result sets that can be used within the same query. So where you would use these traditionally, if you wanted to create lots of temporary tables and gather results and aggregate them and then use them later on in the query, using common table expressions essentially lets you do exactly the same thing. And we do see some queries coming through the system that are overly complicated or really nasty to look at or are not performing as well as they could. And as often as not, when we get these sent to us and we give them to the analytics guys, what will come back is something like this, a common table expression, where they can actually do it all within a single query without needing to do lots of complicated joins and rejoining back into the same table. So that particular example that I've got there, if I switch back to the database and run it, you'll see it runs nice and quickly as well. So that's come back in under 2 seconds. What that particular one is telling us is the number of unique users, how many days since they started playing the game, and what's the minimum amount of gold they've got at that kind of level. So you can see what it's telling us is most users on their first day, they're only kind of getting up to they've usually got between 0 and 5 gold coins left. But as we get further into their lifespan, you'll see some of them are getting much higher coin balances. But this type of query lets you start doing some really quite interesting things, because you can start aggregating bits of data and then building that into more complex bits of your query later on, and much simpler to do than a lot of kind of complex joins. Well, a lot quicker. Did I have anything? What else did I have in here? So we've done common table expressions, queries, joins. Yep. So I think that probably the next thing to probably mention, because that's about half an hour in now, start giving you some tips, things you maybe haven't picked up on if you started using this already, and things to kind of watch out for. I already mentioned it, I'm repeating myself now, common table expressions. Do use these if you can. It will make your queries much less complex and they'll run much more quickly. If you're used to just doing SQL the way you always have, I would urge you to take a look at the Vertica documentation. Go and take a look at the Vertica reference manuals. There are some very powerful SQL functions that Vertica supports, particularly a lot of analytics ones that will help you a lot, let you do some very complicated things and let Vertica do the hard work rather than you trying to write overly complex queries or download big lumps of data to try and then run further analysis on. What we're actually finding ourselves internally now is more and more and more we're actually using SQL to run our analysis projects rather than plugging into R or Tableau or these sorts of tools. So more and more just actually using the power of Vertica to do the heavy lifting. Select star. You saw me using it in one of my queries there, but do avoid it at all costs if you can. It does hurt performance massively. If you are going to use it, make sure you're using it where you've got quite hard limits set on what you're trying to return from the data, or you will slow down your queries quite a bit. So tend to only use that when you're actually just trying to discover what are the column names and parameter names that are on this row that I can be querying. So be very careful, use it only in very limited ways. If you are using select star, you'll find that we will limit the number of rows you can return from a query that's got select star on it to 10,000 rows. And we'll also limit, on any other query, you'll be limited to a 1 gigabyte download size on any of the data. And this is simply just to maintain the speed of the database and the network connections and stop any one user or one game from absolutely swamping it. If you do want to download massive lumps of data, then turn to the S3 archives for that. What we'd probably also say is if you're getting to the stage you are trying to do that, there's probably a better way of doing what you're trying to do. So come and talk to us and we'll see, is it a case of us needing to set up some special jobs for you, or some help you write some queries or common table expression based queries to give you back exactly what you're needing and a small result set rather than an enormous result set. So come and talk to us if you're struggling and getting into that kind of territory, because we should be able to help you. The other thing that I should mention is if you're doing joins, do try and use the user ID as a joining condition if you can. The way our data is structured in the database cluster, it is distributed by user ID across the cluster. So if you are joining by user ID, you will start getting a lot more parallelism in when your query runs, which will increase the performance massively. So it could be your query will be getting processed on multiple nodes simultaneously. So those are a few kind of quick pointers and tips. Other things to look at for the reference, I mentioned our documentation portal, docs.deltadna.com. There is details of how to get connected and details of how to use and connect to some of the kind of more commonly used tools, DBeaver, OpenOffice, Excel, Tableau, and R. You can connect with pretty much any ODBC compliant tool though. If you are using tools that aren't on this list and are having either any really good experiences or bad experiences, do let us know, and we can help out if you're having a bad experience and try and figure out what's going wrong. If you're having a good experience, then let's get it documented and get it up there, and other people can start using that as well. And finally, I did mention the power of Vertica and some of their SQL extensions, their specific functions. Down towards the bottom of this direct access page, there's a link to the Vertica reference manual. I would encourage anybody, if you're getting into your SQL, to take a look at this, because there's some really, really good stuff in here that will help you write queries that run far quicker and start being able to do some stuff in SQL that you normally wouldn't maybe have thought you could do. So that's the kind of the general quick introduction to direct access. I don't know if anybody has any queries. If you want to stick your hand up and ask any questions, I'll see if I can answer them. Probably not able to get into writing specific queries other than kind of basic ones. I don't want to go drilling into massively complicated queries at this stage. And if there aren't any questions, then do feel free to drop us an email through the support system, or use the support buttons on the portal or documentation site if you want us to give you a hand with anything.
Great, thanks Laurie.
Thanks, cheers.
Cheers, bye.